Rewriting Yorkshire is the theme of the series, and in a sense what we're trying to do, I suppose, is really ask questions about, is there such a thing as Yorkshire writing? What characterises the region that we live in, the city we live in, the county we live in? And really kind of posing those questions. Are there things to be said about post-regeneration Leeds? I don't know. Hopefully we'll find out at the end of the series. But tonight the specific focus is on Leeds itself, on the city. And I suppose really in some ways asking a question, well, where are the boundaries of Leeds? You know? So the format of this evening will be, we'll be kind of in conversation, the three of us. So in a moment, I'll introduce the two writers who are our guests tonight. We want to have a conversation. We very much want to engage you as well in these conversations and these questions. And we'll also be hearing some writing from the writers themselves, so little spotlights of their own fictional work as well. So, just by way of introduction, I suppose, I'll just introduce the two writers, and then we've got the introductions over and done with, and then we can just start. So Andy, first of all, Andrew Kirby. Andy hails from the wrong side of the Pennines. You know, it's about rewriting Yorkshire, and he's from Manchester. But despite that, he did go to Leeds University, and he's lived in Leeds, you know, longer than he did in Manchester.
Years.
19 years you've lived here? Okay.
And my two kids are born in Leeds, so
right. Okay.
and my dad's from Yorkshire, so I'm the only one who was born outside the boundaries.
So we'll let him in. And so both writers, actually, I should have said, are incredibly prolific in terms of what they've produced. They're both veteran writers of short stories, of novels, of journalism, of non-fiction. Andy, particularly, he's a reviewer for the New York Journal of Books and also for the Short Review. He's the author of over 40 short stories and 7 novels, of which 2 are set in Leeds. And I think we'll be hearing a little snippet of both of those, maybe, at some point this evening. I think, for me, Andy's writing digs deep into the interiority of the human condition. He's often called a dark writer, and that might be the case, but I prefer to think about interiority. I don't know why, I just like that phrase. But he's also alert to the external forces that shape it. I think he's very alert to the external environment that shapes the human condition, and the architecture and the topography, I think, of Leeds itself. So that's kind of what's interesting, I think, about his work. Richard, born and bred here, weren't you, in Yorkshire?
Hereabouts.
Has short fiction published in many journals, literary journals, including Riptide, The Stinging Fly, Litro, Firewords. If you write short stories, you'll know that these are really classy journals, really, really good places to be published. And his novel Wild Ink was published by Dead Ink in 2014. He's also written non-fiction, including a bloody history of Leeds. Yeah.
And an absorbing history of toilet paper.
Toilet paper. You know, I said he was highbrow. And written articles as well in his capacity as a journalist for the New Humanist, New Scientist, and the TLS as well. And for me, Richard's writing, what characterises it is a kind of precision of language. I think that's really true of his work, and a kind of enviable use of the imagination. Richard's writing, I think, can take us into all kinds of imaginative, different historical and different places, different worlds. So, 2 very different writers, both Leeds-based. We're going to ask some questions about, you know, the place of Leeds in their work. But first of all, it'd be great if we could give them a warm welcome, I think, just to get them
Thank you.
So, I saw a great tweet last night on Twitter, which said, mapping is not just for geographers. And I like that, because I like the idea of maps and how I think both of your work actually kind of really uses, you know, there's a kind of mapping going on, I think, in both of your writing. So I suppose the first question that I'd love to ask both of you is how is the relationship between Leeds, the city, and your writing, and how you define yourselves as Leeds writers, if you like. So,
thank you.
Over to you.
I've always thought of myself as a Leeds writer because I've only written since I've been over this side of the Pennines. I'd always wanted to write, but never quite put pen to paper. I started to write as soon as I left university. I was doing rubbish part-time jobs, and I was determined to get all my angst out onto paper. It wasn't a story. It was just probably angry rantings, really. But I've always thought of myself as a Leeds writer because I've always wanted to centre a lot of my fiction here, and I've always felt that this is the place that if I would call anywhere home, this would be it. And I'd like to explore it more fully. So I started to do that, and I decided I was going to write a novel without having ever written a short story, without having ever written anything apart from a few rantings in a diary. And I decided to write a novel about Leeds, with Leeds as the main character. There weren't any proper characters in it. It was just Leeds, what happens in Leeds. And since then, I think I've always kept returning to Leeds, just because I think there's a lot of stories to tell, really.
Okay.
I'm originally from Wakefield, which is not actually a suburb of Leeds. It is its own city, and which is 9 miles or so from Leeds. And so Leeds is always kind of orbits Leeds in that sense. And Leeds, when I was growing up, I guess it had sounds slightly ridiculous, but it had a sort of glamour compared to Wakefield. It had an arcade that had Street Fighter 2 in it, that is now where the Trinity stands. It had a Burger King, long before Wakefield had a Burger King. So it had that sort of quality back then. And I've lived there, actually I now live technically in Bradford, but I lived in Leeds for years and years. I still consider this my kind of where I live. It's my city, basically. But having said that, I kind of set my stall out now that I'm quite sceptical about the notion of a Leeds writer, about certainly about defining yourself in terms of the city that you happen to live in or write in. I think writing is quite an internal. Well, for one thing, it's an incredibly complex process, as is anything that's creative. That what comes out of your head is an incredibly mixed up mess, whoever you are. And basically, as a writer, that's how you earn your living. And it's not that simple as to say, this city, the city goes in and what comes out is the book. It's a lot more complicated than that. I'm sure we'll develop this a bit further, but
I think there's something quite condescending saying you're a regional writer.
Exactly.
I think that's sort of a put down, really. The way I'd probably describe myself is I think there's such a thing as a Leeds house, and I don't know if you've been a student here, you've stayed in exactly that house.
Hyde Park.
And they're in Hyde Park, they're in Headingley, they're in Armley, and I've lived in all of them, pretty much. And there's always a sort of odd angled wall or something like that, and I'd say I'm the odd angled wall, really. And it was always in my room in the house as well. So that's the way I'd describe myself.
Well, that kind of underlines what would be my point about the whole thing, is that I was never here as a student. I was here in a kind of a step on from that. I was moved to Leeds when I was in my 20s, in a relationship, buying houses, that kind of thing. So I have a very different view. I never had a Leeds student house, so that's not my experience at all.
Not just a student, this is
still
my time. 16 houses I've lived in, and they've all been the same house. It's been a different street.
Have you thought of moving? I think everyone feels that their experience of Leeds is the Leeds experience. Yeah. And I think that can be misleading and unhelpful.
And there are writers, aren't there, who kind of might use Leeds as a setting, as a landscape. Would you say that you do that, and to what extent do you do that? I mean, I know you do sometimes, Richard, even though you're saying I'm not a Leeds writer, and we will open it up for discussion about what is a Leeds writer in a little while. And you yes, you use the landscape maybe, or the architecture of Leeds in a different way. Do you think, are there writers who maybe just kind of use Leeds as a setting, as a backdrop, as a canvas, or actually are they writing the architecture of the city into their work? We discussed that there were Kate Atkinson, for example, using it as a setting, but I think there are more people writing now, especially in the last couple of years, who are exploring Leeds and mapping Leeds. We've talked about Wes Brown in the past, haven't we? And Wes Brown's forthcoming novel, which is basically an attempt to map Leeds as it is today. That's what I've tried to do in my books as well, which is not just use it as a backdrop,
which is to use Leeds as something which will impact on the characters, which will create action for the characters, which will develop the plot, and it becomes more of a character than anything else. But that's quite often because I write fiction which is more genre than you do.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, I don't know. I kind of, in a way, I think that the question is just a distinction between sort of how deeply you go into the surroundings. So, you know, you use it fairly superficially, it's just a setting, and you go into it a bit more. But either way, I always like what Martin Amis said about real places and putting real places in fiction. He basically said it's not possible, because no matter how good your intentions are, as soon as you do it, it gets stretched out of shape. It gets the fiction takes it over, and that's completely true. Certainly, if ever I try to write about somewhere real, it's not real anymore. It's yours, and that's something I'm conscious of. So I don't feel that if I write about Leeds, which, as you say, I don't do much, but I do a bit. If I do that, it doesn't make it any more real than the places that if I write about 1920s New York, for instance, which I'm going to read from in a bit, or wherever.
And I guess the reality of the setting is actually in the imagination of the reader anyway. You know, every reader's experience of Leeds or wherever is going to be different anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
And yet they teach you in writing school, you know, if you're going to write about a place, you have to walk the streets and name the streets, and you know, and actually it's that kind of thing of what is real and what is.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a tension because, it reminds me of Vladimir Nabokov used to insist that when he lectured at Cornell, he used to insist that his students knew, they knew in Metamorphosis what kind of insect Gregor Mendel woke up as. He got very cross about it. It was a domed beetle, you have to, not a cockroach. And he also insisted in Ulysses that they had to know every street of Bloom's Dublin. And I wouldn't disagree with that, because he got frustrated by, they get hung up on the Homeric, you know, Ulysses is full of references to Homer and the Odyssey, and he used to get hung up on people trying to do these slightly simplistic metaphorical readings, and he just said, look at the detail, you know, you want to know about the streets, but that doesn't mean that that's the real Dublin, it's Bloom's Dublin, and
arguably Joyce's Dublin.
Exactly, absolutely, yeah. So it's a difficult one.
Yeah. Okay. I think it'd be great to hear from some of your work, actually, now. So I'm going to ask Richard, actually, with that in mind, the sense of, yes, you sometimes write about Leeds, but also place seems to be more elastic for you in terms of your the body of your work. So I'm just going to ask you to read a short extract from a piece set in Manhattan, I think, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Okay.
It's set in Manhattan in the 1920s. It's going to call for a slight leap of imagination on your part, because I can try the accent, but I can't sound like a teenage girl. So it's narrated by a teenage girl, and the accent will be pain enough for you, trust me. It's a story called Crying Just Like Anybody, and I have copies of this anthology to sell afterwards. He was a little guy, 5'2", 5'3". His mouth was too wide to fit his face, and he didn't have any hair. He sat with his legs neatly crossed on a deal crate, and I could see his dirty woolen ankle socks. I don't know, I said. Johnny nudged me. Sure he is, he said. I shook my head and said it again. Johnny, I don't know. The little guy was watching us. He seemed interested. Sure he is. I don't know, I said. I mean, he doesn't look like a Martian. Sure he does. Sheriff Neck Hazard Mini Must, the Martian said. See? Said Johnny. Johnny's Gianni, really, but around here no one calls anyone by their right name. There's little Tomas Keys, who's Spanish, but he's called Tom Keys. And there's my sister Yeska, and the boys call her Yes and make dirty jokes about it. At the repair shop, Mr. White is really Mr. Vice, and then there's Cy Portman, who works for the grocer and wears braces on his legs, and he's just called Dum Dum. Johnny ought to be Gianni, really, but everyone calls him Johnny. He doesn't mind. He met me after work. I waitress. It was around 11. Anna, he said, grabbed my elbow. Anna's my right name, at least. Anna Moller, with an umlaut. I pulled my elbow away. Careful, kid, this is a new goddamn coat. It was, too. You'll never guess, he said. So you better tell me. Go ahead and guess. I sighed. I've been working all day, I said. I'm tired. Go ahead and guess. He was all excited about something. He couldn't stop grinning. When he grins, you can see where there were 2 teeth missing in his upper jaw. His father did it one time. I tried to guess. Babe Herman went 6 for 6. You found a buck in the street. Clara Bow sent you a postcard. Nope, Johnny said. Then I give up. You won't believe me if I tell you. What the hell is this, Johnny? Maybe you better just see for yourself, Johnny said. He took hold of my hand. This was all outside the doorway of Henry Moon's place at the ocean end of De Peyster. It wasn't lit, and I thought Johnny was going to kiss me there in the dark. I thought it was a hell of a way to lead up to kissing a girl, but I was ready to be kissed anyway. I said, Johnny? Johnny said something, but right then an L train went by overhead and I didn't hear what it was. He didn't kiss me. He just led me by the hand out of the darkness and up De Peyster and onto front. Where are we going? You'll see. He walked too fast. I had on these high-heeled shoes and I couldn't keep up. Slow down, damn it. Where's the goddamn emergency? Johnny just laughed. He led me into an alleyway I didn't even know the name of. This is where he kisses me, I thought. And who knows what else. But instead, he opened the wormy blue door in the wall and pointed inside. There's a light on. I looked inside and there was this little guy sitting on a deal crate. He smiled at me. Who the hell's this? I said. My father's a teacher. He taught at a school across the bridge until some girl complained. This was in the war. My father's a German. Now he works in the garment district helping the Jews with their taxes and things, but underneath that he's still a teacher. He taught me and my sisters to read and write. I wanted to ask him about Johnny's Martian, but I didn't dare. I didn't want to get Johnny into trouble. And I didn't want my father to laugh at me. He was in the kitchen eating livers on toast when I got home. He likes to sit up late. He had a book open and a glass of something. Good evening, Anna, he said. My father talks very polite English. I asked him about Mars. He swallowed the piece of toast he was eating and put a bookmark in his book and closed the book. Why do you ask? I shrugged. My father stood up, came around the table and put his left hand on my shoulder. With his right hand, he opened the door to the street. It was cold out and my father was only in his shirt sleeves and a singlet underneath, but he didn't seem to mind. We stood side by side on the doorstep. We live on Trundle Row, which is off Catherine Street, which is off Henry Street. We live way out of the way in Midtown is what I mean. There's nothing in Trundle Row but trash cans and cats and fruit crates. Since my mother died, no one even sweeps the step. Beautiful, my father said. Actually, he said wunderschön, which means the same. He wasn't looking at the trash cans. He was looking up. I looked up too. Beautiful, I said. I said it in English. It was one of those clear nights, and between the gutters of the houses I could see a strip of clear, dark sky, and maybe a dozen stars. There, my father said, pointing. Mars. It just looked like a star. It has 2 moons, he said. The moons are called Fear and Panic. We can't see them from here. I didn't know that, I said. I never knew there was more than 1 moon. Out there, my father said, waving a hand at the sky. There are hundreds. He told me that there are canals on Mars. I asked him who built the canals. Martians, I guess, he said, and laughed. I wondered if the little guy Johnny had found had ever worked in the canals. He didn't look like he'd be any good at digging or loading coal, but I didn't know what else there was for him to do on Mars. Phobos and Deimos, my father said. What? Greek, he said. Fear and panic. Phobos and Deimos. Oh, I said. It's just like I said. Round here, nobody calls anything by their real names.
So that's a very different kind of landscape and topography, isn't it, from Leeds? Obviously, I don't know if you've been to Manhattan. Have you been to Manhattan? No, never. And certainly not in the 1920s.
Exactly, yeah. That's
So I'm really
Mars?
interested in... yeah.
just on a canal holiday.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in how how do you imagine then that landscape? What's the experience of the street names? Do you get a map out? How do you actually sketch the setting?
It kind of goes back to what I was saying before. I mean, these aren't. As soon as you start writing them, they're just in your head, and you can. I was slightly cheating. Not cheating is a strong word, but when I wrote this, I'd just finished a novel set in mid-Manhattan in the 1920s. So when I wrote that, I did have a map pinned up on my desk. But it's still, it's like if someone were to say, well, how can you do this? You've never been to Manhattan. Well, as you say, I've never been to 1925 either. And I feel, I do feel very strongly that they are places, once you've got I think it's important, obviously, it's important not to have, that's written somewhere before, it's important not to have, you can't have a guy get on the Piccadilly line and get off in Shanghai, because that jars with the reader. But beyond that, I think the places you write about are yours to do with as you wish. So when I've written about Leeds or Wakefield or wherever, that's no more real to me than that is.
Thank you. Great. Moving on to Andy then, it'd be great if we could have a bit of your, an extract from your work as well, just something completely different, if you're happy to.
Okay, this is from something that's not yet been published, so I can't sell you a copy. I've got other things to sell, don't I? Okay, 9:15 a.m. Priest had been whistling Don't Let It Rain on my parade earlier, but had left off as we hit the traffic in town. Now the heavy beat of his fingers on the steering wheel matched the jungle drums of the rain on the roof of the Peugeot. Road closures, seemingly at every turn. More and more cars chugging onto a city loop, which was pretty much impenetrable and incomprehensible to anyone but a Leodian on a common garden Monday morning. Drivers winding down their windows to yell at those behind the wheels of other cars, which had sneaked in ahead of them, and then thinking better of it as the water sheeted in through the gap. Commuters driving with the horn, like on the continents, only Leeds seemed pretty incontinent right now. Inner ring road awash, but open, armly gyratory, prone to flooding and clearly being taken one car at a time. Priest, my partner, a man who sinned for breakfast, lunch and dinner, a man who wore the 7 deadlies like a badge on his sleeve, but who's actually not such a bad sort, when taken with a punch of salt. Priest should have been a police in the 70s. He was tall enough for it, drunk enough for it, and get enough drunk inside him, he'd got the attitude for it too. Though he'd attended this discrimination awareness workshops, the wisdom of it had simply washed all over him. Get him on the whiskies and he'd tell you who he really thought was to blame for Leeds' problems. Clue, it wasn't the overreaching bankers. Priest, my once upon a partner in crime, when I was still the Grosvenor Casino's all-star customer. Suppose that was why I abided with him, because he'd let me move on, because I hadn't let it slip to any of my superiors just how bad it got for me. He'd got my back, I'd got his. Oh, isn't that nice? Didn't stop him with the close to the local banter though. We're police, that's how we get through the day. Indicate if you're going to switch lanes, you bastard. I'm not playing, I muttered. I loosed the top of the Starbucks. Judging by the steam pouring off it, it was still too hot to drink. Would still burn the roof of my mouth at tea time tonight at this rate. Still, it was coffee. Wasn't that long ago I'd forgone coffee, booze and sugar, and everything else good in my life. Kept myself like a nun so that I could give myself up to the higher power of healthy living and, well, I did it so the treatment would work. Yeah, tramp sidles in to get out the rain, gets all comfy, then bosh! Leeds gets hit by a tidal wave. I mean, fair play to our tramp. Leeds is about as far away from the sea as you're likely to get in England, and yet we get a bloody tsunami. Just unlucky, I suppose. You try and get me to rise to the bait, I said. Cole said it was a female body. Priest swung around in his seat. His eyes were suddenly alive, like they'd forgotten they were supposed to be bloodshot still, sodden in last night's booze still. Oh ho, your money's on a prosy then, he nodded appreciatively. Not a bad guess, Alex, not bad at all. Counted off the reasons why on his fingers. Near David Street, and it's notorious for them round there. Mention of a short skirt in the dispatch. The fact every other goddamn body we take a look at happens to belong to a hooker. Then using his other hand, he counted off the reasons why not. David Street's been cleaned up recently, and most of you ladies of the night have got homes to go to. Shitholes maybe, but homes nonetheless. If they were left to just rot on the street, they'd hardly make a bean. A woman needs to at least make a token effort for a punter. I tuned him out, pressed my face to the glass of the passenger side window like an orphan. To our left, Leeds. In the foreground, just off the ring road, the majestic wine warehouse, looking anything but. Standing in a pool of water and maybe wine, it looked bedraggled, beaten down. Past it, a skyline of apartment buildings, barely a one of them full. According to rumour, the only ones even approaching capacity, those which had bitten the bullet and let in the DHSS tenants and illegal immigrants by the boatload. Those young, urban professionals, the original target market for the developers, had fled the nest. Slipped off anywhere, swallowing their pride in the massive losses when they sold their 200k flats for barely half of that just to get rid. And probably now, for the first time, thanking their luckies because the apartment blocks closest to us were built on an island between the River Aire and the Leeds-Liverpool Canal. Only There wasn't an island there now, just a strait of water. It reminded me of the road to Lindisfarne when the tide slept in. Though there was no sun shining on our woeful, abandoned Leeds at all, the brown water all around us appeared to glimmer and glint. Perhaps there was sunken treasure down there. Perhaps that was what happened to all the money. Priest tapped me on the shoulder, undunked me from my reverie. I told you we should have whacked on the blues and twos on the roof. I shrugged. Nowhere anyone can go, even if we do. It was true. Cars were stacked up in every lane. A good measure of how long we had to wait was the fact I managed to drink about half the Starbucks before we finally inched out onto the grandly named roundabout at Armley. Calling it a gyrator, he always made me think of Elvis, gyrating his hips, wowing women like my mother into thinking there was something in his life for her beyond the mundanity of Leeds. On the roundabout, the water stood like a royal guard at the palace. A lorry had aquaplaned off it, right onto the grassy knoll at the centre of it, and an ambulance, 2 police vans were seen to it. Cones floated every which way but loose. More rain fell, and harder rain threatened. The sky was so grey I could barely make out the Castle Grayskull HMP Leeds over the other side of the roundabout. Priest hung a left, queued under the railway tunnel, and then took another left, and the traffic began to thin out. We'd entered an area of the city centre which the gentrification of the rest of Leeds had forgotten. Ah, Holbeck, sighed Priest. He wrinkled his nostrils. Can you smell that, Alex? That's the smell of success. It's the smell of something, all right. Just don't go winding the window down. Holbeck was a warren of old industrial units and factories which used to make the types of things which weren't exactly in demand in Leeds' central business district anymore. It was full of old red brick mill-type buildings and low-slung concrete eyesores. The vast majority of the buildings were derelict and moribund, but occasionally, like the grass which springs up in the cracks of paving stones, there was a random business which had stayed alive against all the odds. Tyre dealers, which supposedly sold new tyres which hadn't been pilfered from the back of a lorry. Honest gov, from as little as a tenner. A few odd little caffs and newsagents, a lonely pub which had once belonged to a former Leeds United player from back in the days when footballers had to find new jobs to keep them going in the good night of their retirement from the game. We took Globe Road, which would eventually lead back to the city centre, to the place where banks and law firms and call centres and head offices and supermarkets and IT and marketing companies proliferated, to the place where the building frontages were all glass, but the work which went on within was hardly transparent. We passed the buildings with tall, crumbling chimneys, which even managed to see past the elevated advertising hoardings, which advertised products not meant for the people who'd remained in Holbeck, but rather for those wealthier candidates which rode the trains back to London. We took Globe Road, which showed the two worlds of Leeds, the still rich and the much poorer, at the point of intersection, which showed the transition point between Leeds as the eternal caterpillar and Leeds the wannabe butterfly. Around about halfway along it, the streets got cleaner. David Street, which intersected Globe, was once upon a time famous for its streetwalkers. Not anymore. Now the only pedestrian traffic were those suited and booted men and women scurrying for their cars towards the new media centres at places like the Round Foundry. They look like insects under their umbrellas. I'll leave it there.
So in that short extract, we have quite a lot of the Leeds landscape really kind of crammed into that short
That's why
piece of writing.
it's all about Leeds.
So it's an example of it's a crime novel, isn't it? So I want to kind of pick up on that thread of crime in a minute. But I know, in a way, just now, I just want to kind of open it up to the floor really and think about. I'll ask the question. Is there such a thing as a Leeds writer, in your opinion? I know for a fact we've got some writers here who use Leeds in their work, who write about Leeds. So I'm kind of interested in people's take on, is there what people's views are on Leeds. Chris.
Well, I do write about Leeds a lot.
Yeah.
And to me, Leeds is very much a character in my books. I write historical crime. So my most recent is the 1950s. But Leeds is a changing landscape, which I think Andy's definitely picked up on his. But also to go on what Richard said, I think regardless of time or place, if you make the reader feel they've had an immersive experience, that they've been there, they've seen, smelt, heard the place, then you've succeeded. But to me, Leeds is more than that, because it's a question that came up actually back in the summer. Is there actually something that encapsulates Leeds that makes it very different from anywhere else? And that's not an easy question to answer. I think there is, but I'm not honestly sure I can define it. Doesn't help a whole hell of a lot, but
Doesn't every northern city say that? Or every city say that?
Yeah.
Every city thinks they've got a unique sense of humour and a unique culture, and that people from there are different to everybody from everywhere else.
well, actually I think Nick has a point, because everywhere is a little different.
But do you think you could pick it out?
No, probably not.
So yeah, that makes it, to me, you know, how meaningful can it be if you
everywhere
can't
has
identify
its cultural pride, which is really what that is.
But what's that built from? I mean, going back to what you were saying, in what sense is Leeds a character? I mean, to me, I get what you're saying in that it's important to the work, but do you mean it beyond that, as in that it has a character?
Leeds has a sense and a sensibility.
Can you define that?
Okay, for example, Leeds still has standing more back-to-back houses than anywhere else in the country. They kept building them after they were stopped building them elsewhere. If you want to talk student house, that's basically what you're talking, isn't it? Back-to-back.
Yeah, absolutely. Find it everywhere.
And that characterised a class
Yeah.
for so many years. And now it characterises a different class. It characterises a middle class sort of in transition from school to adulthood, instead of a working class.
Yeah.
So the buildings, the architecture, do define a place. Leeds, what we have left primarily from Victorian times, are either the very poor, the back-to-backs, or the public, grand public Victorian buildings. Either the ones erected as, you know, like the town hall or the Corn Exchange, or the pillars of commerce like the various insurance buildings off Park Row and what have you. So we were one of the cities of empire, if you like, and that defined Leeds for a while. But at the same time, you move a little out of the city centre. Meanwood Road, Sheepscot, it was industry. And what Leeds was has vanished.
Yeah.
What Leeds is far more, to me, far more characterless. So I'm trying to... Leeds now is retail and finance. Where office buildings and shopping malls that could be anywhere. You walk up Briggate, all those shops you'll find in any town.
Oh yeah, I think that's.
Well, I think that's
It's the people.
Well, yeah.
And that's what defines every city, that the people in that city have a different experience of living than in another city, and that's what defines
And
them.
also, just simple things like the industries of that city can affect how the people behaved up. Say, there's a really quick one. Say, if you look at the 1980s scene, there was a lot of fashion-y type stuff going in Leeds, and Sheffield were churning out music. It was like, and I would, you know, is that connected to sort of Leeds being a tailoring city and all that sort of thing, and Sheffield being a...
And it's the people, years ago, and I've lived in Leeds for a very long time, I could walk through Leeds and I would know 2 or 3 people. I would walk down Briggate and I would see people in the Cardoma, I would see people in the Milkmaid, I'd see people. I came into Leeds 2 or 3 weeks ago and I walked from the market and I walked through to cafe, whatever it is, some cafe, and I did not hear, and I loved it because it was all the languages that I could hear. And so Leeds has changed massively.
I like that idea of a city. I like the idea of a city in transition, and I think that for me, in terms of like the representations of Leeds, the literary representations of Leeds, that's really true. If you look at David Peace's work, for example, you know, the Red Riding Quartet, that's kind of that's encapsulating a specific time and place. Leeds now looks very different. Carol Phillips' work, I don't know if anyone's read his latest novel, The Lost Child. deals with, you know, Leeds in that kind of post-industrial era, and he came to Leeds recently to read and said, you know, Leeds is totally different, and he brought with him a friend from the States who didn't know Leeds, had never been to Leeds, but knew Leeds through Carol Phillips' eyes, you know, a very, very different Leeds to what was represented in this contemporary novel, which was harking back to a historic Leeds. So I think I like the idea of, you know, that kind of shifting landscape, and I think transition is interesting in terms of both buildings and quay. I know people are really desperate to speak, but I'd love to. I'm just very conscious of time. I want to move on and cover other stuff. We can there'll be time at the end for more questions, so perhaps we can come back to these issues and topics then. I want to move on to think about crime. Andy read us a section from his crime novel, and I think for me, well, we've talked about this before, haven't we, that you know, Leeds, somehow the character of Leeds, the characteristic of Leeds writing is kind of crime and deviance. And I just wondered, you know, what you thought of that issue.
You mentioned David Peace, and I read an interview with him recently where he said the biggest influence on how he wrote and what he wrote was growing up in the 70s near Leeds in the time of the Yorkshire Ripper, and that's why he wrote what he wrote.
Interestingly, from Japan.
Exactly.
Which we can talk about.
Well, he wrote the first couple of novels of the trilogy while he was for himself, while he was in a bedsit in Manchester, but the rest of it he wrote in Japan when he realised it was for other people. But initially he wrote it as just for himself, apparently.
Yeah.
But I think it's location and setting and is probably more important in crime fiction than any other genre or in literary fiction. I think that's probably going back to Conan Doyle and things like that, when you've got a sort of a very ordered society, very neat and tidy, and then a crime takes place which throws everything out of kilter, and then the point of the book, the point of the detective coming in to solve the crime is to tie up all the loose ends and make everything smooth and fine again. And then that sort of changed with Chandler, I think, in writing about LA, and he writes about this dark city and which reflects the characters' moods in a pathetic fallacy almost, and then it becomes a kind of love-hate relationship between the city and the lead character, usually the detective, and that I can see where people come from, that can sometimes be taken too far, in that every city becomes this sort of Gotham City, which is and you've got someone sitting on top of a big high building looking down on it saying, "The city is my mistress, I love it and hate it at the same time," and all this nonsense, which is basically almost what it becomes, and you've got to be really careful when you're writing about it that you don't just make it ridiculous. But I think because you're talking about the scene of a crime and you're talking about all the things that feed into it, location just becomes more and more crucial. I mean, people read crime novels partly to find this resolution, but also to read because they know people like reading Rankin because of Edinburgh.
I think there's a more practical purpose as well as what you're saying. I think that basically most certainly kind of police-based crime fiction is procedural.
Yeah.
And so much, if you go back to Hammett and Chandler, and right up to the modern stuff, you're talking about, I drove down such and such street,
so they're walking a beat.
Street, I went to find it. It's a necessary part of what's happening. What's happening is you're describing a series of kind of events in and it has to be a place. And if you try to write it in a, with vagueness and without specifying, I think you'd really struggle sometimes.
And we've talked before about this issue of dirty Leeds, and do you think, Andy, I know you've got some thoughts on this and how, dirty Leeds, that portrayal of Leeds Football Club being corrupt, corruption is quite an interesting thing, I think, in terms
the whole,
of Peace looks at that
sort
as
of
well. But
foul play, sniff and sinister thing that is alleged about that team. I mean, people still call Leeds dirty Leeds now, don't they? And it's this whole it's mythologised really, and it's gone into a sort of wider cultural landscape. There was a bit of police corruption going on in the 70s as well, and it's all feeding into this
I think as soon as that happens, though, it becomes a self-fulfilling.
Yeah,
not
exactly.
quite prophecy, but it becomes people buy into mythology. People from Leeds, from roundabout Leeds, decide that they like that. That's got that romantic
Yeah, it has
kind
definitely.
of feel, and you want a bit of it, and that perpetuates. I don't know. This is. I might start sounding slightly pretentious here, so throw stones if I do. But I was reading something recently about a new book called Weatherland by Alexandra Harris, which is a survey of weather in English literature. But she points out a really interesting thing. There's a study, because everyone thinks about Wuthering Heights, which is obviously Haworth not far, and everyone thinks that it's all about storms and darkness and howling gales. And there was a study carried out a few years ago, which found that actually if you look at the book page by page, it's there's just as much sunshine as there is rain, and it's so and the. Say again?
That's Hollywood for you.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was quite interesting. The analogy that I drew was with, again, slightly pretentious, but with the distinction between climate and weather. So, which is often kind of misunderstood, because weather is what happens day to day, which you could say is analogous with what happens page to page, whereas the climate is kind of the prevailing patterns. So if you read Wuthering Heights, it's not unreasonable to say that that is the prevailing, that it is dark and it is blustery and gloomy, regardless of what happens page to page. And I think you can also say that, with a slight stretch, about a city. I think you can talk about its climate. It doesn't mean that it's literally the case every day that it's bleak and gritty, but if that is its overhanging.
Yeah, and that raises questions about sort of where the boundary of the city is really. Where does the city begin and end? Where do the countryside, the provinces? I don't know. I think
it ends outside Wakefield.
I mean, thinking of David Peace, he sort of said. He talks about his relationship with Leeds, growing up in Leeds, and how the kind of that era of the Yorkshire Ripper really, he felt the architecture of Leeds was really grim to him. He found it a deeply frightening place. He says, and then you got out of the city and it was very, very bleak. It's almost like the antithesis, that there's a kind of anti-romanticism perhaps that's going on there in a sense. And so I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on, kind of the relationship between city and either suburbs or kind of, the sort of more pastoral landscape, or because lots of Yorkshire writers do set their writing in the countryside. Is that just as bleak? I don't know.
Yeah, if you've read Ross Ray's, which fantastic.
Yes.
God's Own Country. I read it recently because one of your colleagues released a list of the top 30 so Yorkshire books.
Dr. Tom Heron chose 13 books, I think, that characterise Yorkshire writing.
13.
13.
13.
I think so, yeah.
And all written since the millennium.
Yeah.
And that was one of them, so I picked it up and read it, and it was very, very dark. Written by a Leeds writer, probably, because it was that dark. But
I think he grew up in Ilkley.
Did he? Oh, right, well.
But he'll be bracketed with Leeds.
Probably eating avocados. I was writing it.
All the best people.
But no, I thought that drew a line between country and city.
It opens, the opening scene of that is the central character who grows up in the countryside talking about townies coming to the country, with their waterproof sauna or whatever, and it really, really kind of, it just really sends up this idea of
throwing sheep
coming
poo
to
at them.
Yeah, exactly.
It was very good.
Yeah. And also I'm thinking of, I think the phrase is like Northern Gothic or something.
Yeah.
Have you heard that before?
Yeah, I don't know.
What do you make of that?
I'm not kind of widely read in the, whatever you call it, it's not quite a genre, but whatever you would call that. I'm just slightly wary of anything that sets a single tone. I don't think it's valuable to, I think, as a writer, genre fiction is a slightly different area, I guess, but as a writer, you're trying to reflect complexity. In my view, you should be. And if you're just setting a one tone and that's it, I feel that's kind of a bit of a waste. And I feel like I don't know, because you then get this, as I kind of suggested earlier, this sort of self-fulfilling thing. And if someone writes dark stuff, then that's Yorkshire writing, that's proper Yorkshire writing. And if someone, it's not like, if you look back at the kind of 50s and the Angry Young Men, it's not like at that time everybody was an angry young man and no one was writing swooning romantic fiction. They were, they just weren't getting published or weren't getting reviewed and weren't getting talked about on TV or the radio. So you just get this definition of this. I mean, you might have, I don't know if you've heard of the no true Scotsman fallacy, which is kind of a Scotsman says, oh, no Scotsman would ever, put water in his whiskey. And then you point out the Scotsman doing it and they go, oh, no, true Scotsman would never put water in his whiskey. So you get this sort of, you get very reductionist about what constitutes such and such a regional production, and I find that's quite dangerous ultimately.
So I guess there's something there about the regional, but Leeds also, I mean, we've mentioned two names already, David Peace, who else? Carol Phillips, thank you. It's been a long day. And arguably Sanjeev Sahota as well, who, I mean, although he's Sheffield-based, he did live in Leeds, and he is kind of drawing on that kind of, it's not Leeds, but where are the boundaries of Leeds? Yeah. I don't know. There's a sort of regionalism that's also become a kind of global phenomenon as well. Carol Phillips was brought up in Leeds, but now lives in the US, via Caribbean kind of heritage. And so I wonder, is there a place for thinking about the dynamics between the sort of local, regional and the global? And I'm thinking about the comments about, the languages, the multicultural kind of society. I don't know, is there something in that, and what would that be in terms of defining a Leeds writer if we were going to do such a reductive thing? I don't know, it's a big question, but...
it is, and as two... white Leeds people were maybe not the best place to qualify. Something that occurred to me, might tie in with this, that you mentioned the list of Yorkshire books or Leeds books.
Yeah, Yorkshire books.
One of the things that I really jumped out at me was when that did the rounds on social media. I can't remember if this was the original headline or if it was a headline someone had put on it on Twitter or whatever, but it said something like 13 books everyone from Yorkshire should read. And I just thought, that's ridiculous, that's crazy. Everyone not from Yorkshire should read these, everyone in Yorkshire should read something else. That kind of inward-lookingness is absolutely crazy to me. And so, it ties in with the sort of... I've got no problem at all with representing your city and reflecting your city in your fiction, your city feeding into what you create. But I do think you're on shaky ground when that's all you care about is literature that's in your postcode. I mean, what?
Yeah.
Because I don't feel.
I agree with that.
Sorry.
Well, yeah. No, I totally agree with that.
I don't feel. I mean, you either say that all Yorkshire writing has this in common, in which case you're shutting out quite a lot. Are you shutting out me because I'm from Wakefield, or that kind of thing? You would, I know you would. Or you're saying it doesn't really matter. In which case, what's the point? You might as well write about writers with brown hair. So it's difficult. I'm just sorry. I'll shut up in a minute. But it's slightly reminiscent to me sometimes of. I don't know if anyone. Some of you might remember in the kind of 50s and 60s. I think folk music was taking off, and Ewan MacColl, who was the king of folk music at the time, he was ludicrously sort of Nazi about if you were Scottish, if you're a Scottish folk singer in the 50s in Ewan MacColl's clubs, you had to sing Scottish songs. You weren't allowed to do anything else. You had to do the ones that were part of your heritage, and so on. You weren't allowed to import and conflate and bring together all these interesting things. So that's kind of a warning for me.
Sure, yeah. I'm going to ask you to read again now, Richard, actually. Sorry, have some wine first, it's all right. Just because I think, there are issues around sort of alienation and place and migration and transition and kind of, identity shifting and moving. So I'm going to ask you to write, this time, a story that is set in Leeds. Is that right?
Yeah, between Leeds and Bradford,
which kind of deals with these issues of, shifting identities within that sense of place. So moving into, I guess, a kind of city environment and what that throws up in terms of identity. I'll read two very short sections that miss a bit in the middle. It's all narrated by the same guy, but at the start he talks about himself in the third person, so just to prevent confusion. And it's set in Leeds, and it's a bit odd. All along Vicar Lane, construction cranes struck angular poses against the dusk sky. A welder's torch burned somewhere in the scaffolding. "Lord, deliver me," the Swami said. His hands closed around the unsmooth steel of a scaffolding strut.
Lord, Lord, the Swami said, and began to climb. He did not know to what Lord he addressed his prayer. The Swami had never before sought a master or a messiah. He had never before asked for deliverance. Up he climbed, pulling the steel pole through the grip of his hands, arms, lean thighs, bare feet, as a worm pulls the earth, piece by piece, through the grip of its long body. At the second floor, an unstable corridor of scaffolding, bleached pallets between walls of day-glow polyethylene mesh, he rested. He flexed his toes and wrung each of his biceps in turn. From here, he could hear the river-like roar of the welder's torch, though he could no longer see its light. From here, the geometry of the red cranes was different. Stars and planets showed in the sky. Deliver me, the Swami said again. He looked up. The boards above his head were a dusty orange in the glow of the sodium streetlights below. Woodlice patrolled the loose grain. The Swami jerked in a breath, leapt backwards, gripped the edge above, and swung. For a moment his centre of gravity shifted, and he hung, heavy as a plumb line, over 40 feet of empty space. His feet kicked at the day-glow plastic. His fingers located a crack between boards. He clutched, pulled. His knee found the brink. His gravity shifted. He lay face down on the cool boards, gasping dust. Delivered. In the street so far below, a drunk woman whooped like a jungle bird. Something smashed. A bottle, a shop window, a car's wing mirror. The Swami didn't know. He stood unsteadily. The beating of his heart almost overwhelmed him. It was such that he felt as though he was being shaken, worried by his heart, like a rat by a dog. This had been only a small deliverance, and many such would be necessary in the construction of the Swami's greater deliverance. He trembled forward, and bunching the flimsy plastic mesh of the fence in his fists, peered downward. Vicar Lane was a canal of off-yellow light. A small man, small from here of course, but small too in actuality, small in soul as well as in body, ran in a zigzagged course along the broad pavement. He was looking all about him, urgently, wildly, but never above him, never upward. That was not this man's way. Looking across the derelict square in which a new shopping centre would soon rise, the Swami could see on the third storey the corona of the diligent welder's steady burning torch. He heard the man far below call out a name. Peter! The Swami looked up. Another glow. Another fire. Blue, this, in counterpoint to oxyacetylene red. It was a signal light of a helicopter, banking low and slow in uncanny anti-gravity over the roof of the building. A police helicopter. Deliver me, the Swami said. My father wore a sharp beard in the shape of the third pip on 3 of spades. He lived in the Glenside estate in the shadow of the heights, though only the long shadows of winter literally cast the dark of the heights upon his panel-fronted first-floor flat. His nose was long and pale, what in a school colouring pencil was called flesh-coloured, in the Gujarati blue-brown of his face. Sometimes he would sit on a stool behind the counter of his brother's convenience shop, smiling upon all alike, smokers, lotto players, drunks, schoolchildren clustering around the chest freezer or chiller cabinet, shoplifters, daily buyers of newspaper and milk. Smiling too upon the transactions of paper and coin that slithered back and forth across the palm of his open right hand, which, like his nose, was long and pale. Another transaction, this slithering, slippery too, he had just as smilingly disavowed. He had waved his hands, my mother said, and bashfully lowered his long-lashed eyelids. No, no. My mother approximated the hamstrung Indian vowel, tongue-tip snapping down from pallet roof. No, miss. A child, a boy. It cannot be. It will not be. He had walked away without turning his back as one takes leave of a queen, until he reached his moped, propped at the curb on one frail foot. There were many, 6 of us, all by some genetical kook, were boys. In the main, I think we were distinguished by our gentleness. And although Depeche Monsieur would never furnish a home, nor food, nor pocket money for his half-breeds, he had, by the time I was 6, owned his multiple paternity, and he paid out a palimony of shy smiles, puzzled fondness, sweets pilfered from his brother's shop, and tall tales haltingly told. One summer's day, for instance, a group of us lounged in a desultory half-circle on the halfway line of the football pitch. 3 or 4 turbaned teenaged Indians, stripped to the waist, booted a twanging plastic football back and forth. These were Depeche's cousins. Though we never thought of it, these were our cousins. Depeche, our father, disdaining their game, squatted among us and said that when his tall-masted ship sailed from Porbandar, he, aboard, had carried with him a half-dozen peacock eggs. We swallowed the tall-masted ship, but choked on the peacocks. Depeche raised an open hand and swore that it was true. Eat 'em? Somebody demanded hungrily. It would not have been me. Depeche's bastards, I the youngest, the last, was also the most silent. No, our father said. He had incubated the eggs on the smoking motor of his moped. All had hatched. No, he corrected himself. 1 had cracked, and this he had cooked in an omelette. But the remaining 5 had hatched and grown to fullness. He shared his home in the Glenside estate, he said, with these 5 fine peacocks, the finest, finer by far than the finest in all Gujarat. I, twisting my small finger in the stem of a daisy, blinked at the muster of tears in my eyes. For here was Depeche, our father, who would dwell with peacocks, but not with us, his sons. Not with me, his son. At that moment, watching the head of the broken daisy furl in on itself within the crook of my finger, I saw Depeche, not as he was, smiling and crouched limbly on his hams in the sunny centre circle. I would not look at him. I saw him as though my hand and the daisy were a picture stained in a pane of glass, and Depeche, my father, was beyond the glass. I saw him in full figure, limbs spread, foregrounded against a powder blue sky, flying, or falling, or bouncing on a trampoline. It's curious to think that Depeche, when he told us that story, was only 26 or 27 years old. He had so very few years left. And if the Swami's gift or habit of prophecy seems tiresome to you, then consider how tiresome it soon became for the Swami. I have said that all told we were 6 boys, and indeed we were. Just as there were 6 peacock's eggs, until the one cracked in the heat and smoke.
So, just shifting focus slightly, thinking about you as practicing writers who started writing in Leeds.
Yeah.
And it'd be really good, I think, to think about how, what are the sort of spaces in Leeds? What does the landscape look like in terms of people out there writing, festivals, you know, the kind of literary activity of Leeds as it is at the moment? How you see that?
Well, a good place to start would probably be the editorial of the Granter issue, which described Leeds as completely out of the literary world a couple of years ago. And I think since then, massive progress has been made, massive strides have been taken. There were festivals. There was Ilkley Festival, there was Morley Festival, there was Headingley Festival. We've now got a Leeds Book Festival, the Big Book End,
which Fiona
and which basically has swept up writers such as myself and Richard and forced us to keep coming to do things like this. Yeah, thanks. But has really sort of opened doors for us. I think the geography of Leeds as a sort of literary community wasn't joined up at all, and it's becoming more and more coherent, really. And I think there's, I mean, just last week, Hyde Park Book Club opened, and they're having lots of really good events, and lots of open nights, and they're also offering to sell our books, which is fantastic. And then there's various other little societies, and everything's sort of becoming more and more coherent, really. I think that's the most important thing.
It still punches below its weight.
Yeah.
By some distance. We look at Manchester. This is quantitative, not qualitative. This is look at the number of events that they have, literary events. They have loads, and Leeds has fictions of every kind, which is wonderful. Which Sarah Bradley, S.J. Bradley, runs every 3 months, 2 months.
2 months, I think it is, yeah.
And which is getting in some fantastic writers. And beyond that, there's the odd one. Words on Tap comes and goes, but there's really not a lot for a city of this size. And certainly in terms of I don't know, it's difficult with, as we kind of discussed this before, Headingley has its own identity, really, has its own festival, which means it's got its own identity. Places like Morley, obviously. And again, so I don't know. It's difficult to see it as a whole, but Central Leeds certainly doesn't do all it should.
I think that's increasing though. Isn't
it is. Yeah, it's on the up. Don't get me wrong, and mostly thanks to the book end, I think. But there's still it needs to keep going. That momentum needs to be kept up.
Yeah. It's interesting. I just want to read you something just quickly, and then we'll move on to hear Andy's second piece as well. Wes Brown, in the introduction to the LS13 anthology, which was a sort of celebration of 20 Leeds writers, says that much of the writing-related activity is self-organising, located digitally, or goes on in brief, wonderful bursts of energy that come and go as people come and go. So again, it's this issue of sort of transition and coming and going, and it's interesting that that's how you see sort of writing related activity or literary activity is becoming more cohesive, more centralised. We'll see. I don't know.
I have to say, I like the sound of that.
Yeah,
I mean, that's how I feel it should be, really.
Liberating
Just,
in that as well. Yeah. But nonetheless, there are various initiatives, sort of Leeds Bookends and I guess this kind of event really, which are potentialities for cohesion, if we wanted to do that. I'm just aware of time, and it would be brilliant. I think just thinking about sort of the potential and the opportunities for writers. I know that Andy, you've got a book is out there, being considered by publishers now. Is that right?
Yeah, I've got a couple of books that are out there at the moment. Yeah.
So would you read us something then? Again, it's kind of Leeds based in terms of its setting. Would you just sort of finish off and then we'll kind of go to questions. We've probably got a few minutes for questions at the end. Would you read us an extract from one of your
I'll just read really
quickly,
then,
please.
Okay, this Richard's story was called Heights, and mine's from a novel called High Life, which is I was trying to put a different take on Leeds instead of my crime story, which was all dirty Leeds. This is a story which is about the Leeds that I sort of knew when I finished university, which was Leeds was at the top of the tree, and it was going to become the bigger than London, and everything was big and everything was brash. This was us every night, like we were on camera, every night like we were stars of our own show, and fat millions were tuning in to watch us. Everything we did was deliver it, and even if it wasn't, we made it look that way. Cabs would drop us off at the bottom of Coal Lane. We didn't have to take cabs. We were only coming down from City Square, but it was all about our image, how we decab. Everyone watching us, business cash Carl in his pink contrast collar shirt, dollar sign cufflinks, watch as large as a sundial, aviators. Adam, who despite the Leodian cold would have changed into a tight white tee which showed off his biceps and his tan. Me in whatever clothes Ace had in their window display that week. Coal Lane, rampant with skinny jeans and complicated hairstyles. Constellations of neon shining out from the bars and vomit running down the gutters. Bouncers calling one in, one out, and Johnny Yellow as much as a Leeds institution as the football team, walking up and down the queues, strumming his guitar and singing nonsense lyrics, entertaining those unlucky enough to have to wait. Not us, of course, we knew people. On we went, past the Corn Exchange, round the corner, onto Assembly Street, and at last up to our place, the townhouse. Cordons would be opened and we'd step inside like invited vampires, catcalls and complaints from the queue outside, following us over the threshold and up 3 flights of stairs. But by the time we reached the top, the air was more refined. Warmer too. Generally, we lived the life closer to the sun than most. Sometimes we got blinded by it. We lived the high life. By day, we worked at the top floor of one city square. By night, the top floors of clubs. Then back to bed at our penthouses. We were forever looking down on everyone else. We knew it too, deep down. Still, despite the above-it-all atmosphere, it was always busy at the top of the stairs. Girls who spent a week getting ready, trying to talk their way into the VIP section. Fellas pretending they knew a man who knew a man, and couldn't they come in? Look, they had money, if that's what it took. Pointed at VIPs, riddling the bouncers this. What's he got that I haven't? And everyone who was anyone knew the answer. Sometimes Adam or Carl, and sometimes me, who am I trying to kid, would throw a bone to one of the girls, link her arm and guide her past the safe and secure bouncer. This one was even wearing an SAS armband, the type a captain might wear in football, and into the promised land. And of course, she'd be all kinds of grateful, and of course, if she stayed the course, she'd make it up to us back at one of our penthouses. I'll finish there.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we've got a few minutes left for, I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments, observations about Leeds or mapping Leeds or literary representations of Leeds. So just to kind of open it up now to questions or comments from the floor.
I just got a comment really for Richard, that he says that, you say that, Leeds isn't your raison d'etre in terms of writing, and yet you've written about the immigrant experience in New York in a sense, and that's very much the Leeds story too.
Yeah, that's true.
Parallels.
Yeah, that's true. I mean,
it could almost have been Leeds in New York.
Yeah, well, it's true.
And there was height in both of them, I noticed. They were high.
Well, it all this is kind of what I was saying about it all being a mess. I mean, I'm certainly no expert on the immigrant experience anywhere. But the influence. I'm influenced by the places where I grew up. I mean, probably more kind of Dewsbury, Wakefield end of things for me. But I certainly don't disavow its influence or anything like that. But yeah, it all just comes together. It's just a human experience, and the settings for me are just, well, very often they're kind of, dressing makes it sound too superficial, but they're a backdrop. You know, they're places to explore. And made up stuff, basically lies that ideally reveal the truth. That's the basic premise for me.
Question over there.
I'm going to follow that up, Richard, because earlier you said it's not real anymore, it becomes yours.
Yeah.
Which is a way of claiming
Absolutely.
something. And that also that being a regional writer isn't as simple as just being a citizen of a place. But there's a privilege in abdicating that. Right?
Can you elaborate?
To say that I'm not a Leeds writer, to abdicate your citizenship
Yeah.
sounds like a kind of privilege to me. Because I think there are people who desperately want to claim part of Leeds.
Okay.
And to be accepted as part of the fabric of this place. I've lived here for a number of years, but I'm always asked where you're from.
Yeah, sure.
Right? And I always have to work that connection. I have to explain my presence in this place.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. And obviously, yeah, that's something that I haven't experienced in that sense.
But the ability to, like, claim another place, New York, in the 1920s, and have that, and say, well, it's just the same as Leeds, which I think is the parallel you were making, someone who's coming over here, is...
I think if you place fiction at a remove from your personal geography and your personal experience, which I do, I think that becomes less valuable. I mean, it's not like, I don't know how secure I would have to be in my Leedsness for that to become a privilege. Because I'm not from Leeds. I mean, I write about Leeds and I don't feel it.
Dangerous word. Like, I'm not...
No, of course, I realise you don't mean it in the... but I mean, I don't... I kind of disagree. I mean, it's not that I'm not... I think you may be describing an experience that is not... like I say, if I consider my fiction to be at one remove from where I am, that's really key to me. It's not...
I don't want to say that we have to write what we know, right? Like, as you said earlier, and I think valuably, you know, just stick your postcode. It's not like that. That's anathema to creativity.
Yeah.
But instead, I prefer to think, like, explore what you know, and then push against the boundaries of that.
Well, this is what I would say is what you know is not just where you are.
Yeah.
What you know is everything. What I grew up, I've never read anything from... Sorry, do we have to...
No.
I never read anything local, ever, when I was growing up. I read mostly American stuff. And since then I've read, I read all sorts. And that's where we're from.
Yeah.
That's where we're from. It's not... That, to me, is the fundamental point. The streets are just streets. Where you're from is what feeds into your head.
But that influences your writing, even if you're basically...
Of course, it does.
Where you're from,
to whatever degree, yeah.
people you connect with.
Absolutely. Everything, as I was saying before, it's a big mess. Everything just funnels in there.
So you can talk New York, but you can still be a Leeds writer.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
I agree
there
with
is
you,
such a thing as a Leeds writer. Or there is, you see, like, if there's such a thing as Yorkshire writing, then there must be a Yorkshire writer.
I don't think there is such a thing as
It's
Yorkshire
really
writing as
difficult.
such.
I think if you said it singularly, is there such a thing as a Leeds writer? Well, there's me. There's the best Leeds writer.
You are the Leeds writer.
But yes, but I think it's an interesting thing. It's because it'd be really difficult to use a city that you know well as a backdrop. You know that idea of just a backdrop.
Yeah.
Because every little thing that you say about that city, you have an attachment. It might just be 2 words that you add to a sentence, but it gives it a level.
Yeah, but they're yours. That's your personal experience of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but
So-
you know, on a cellular level.
Exactly, but that means it's yours and not the city's. You're not writing about the city.
There's another question there.
Sorry.
No, Lucy's dying
It's the
to.
compact's not being about ownership though, because I think the key to the series is not the writing Yorkshire, so there's nothing key saying it's Yorkshire and we're writing it. We're rewriting it, we're constantly making it. It's something dynamic, it's something
Yeah.
changing.
And
it's every day to day.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
There's nothing
Yeah.
specific. It's this weaving. Kind
It's
of,
shifting and
moving forward,
changing.
It's dynamic. It's
Yeah,
changing.
yeah,
it's-
yeah.
It was something that
But so what does it even mean?
It was. Whereas
That's my whole problem, really. It doesn't mean a lot.
Well, actually, one
And,
thing,
and yeah, and I real sorry.
No, go on.
I'll be really quick.
Yeah, it's holding you for
I realise that I'm not speaking for everyone here. I'm not saying this is the rule for literature. I'm saying for me, place is subordinate to a lot of other influences. But then, I live 20 miles from where I was born, so place is a given for me. So, and I accept that.
I think I think there is something really interesting in that, in terms of the, as Lucy said, the kind of that we're kind of rewriting as a continual kind of transition and transformation. And yes, sorry, one more question here. Go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say that it's not about reflecting place, is it? It's about producing place through voice. Because what struck me in all your pieces was how distinct the different voices were that we heard. And they're not your voices, they're voices that you've imaginatively created. But at the same time, those voices produce a sense of place. So it's not about reflecting a place, is it? It's about kind of constructing a voice, which is somehow a voice of a place, or voices of places in different ways. Sorry.
Yeah. No. I thought so. Sorry, that's a really good point.
Green City, one of the things that I'm learning is how green Leeds is. So many parks. So when people
I
came
wrote
to
a
Leeds,
chapter about it.
I'm learning.
Tell us more, then.
They kept saying we didn't realise how green Leeds was, how many trees there are.
So not dirty Leeds at all, actually.
Well, exactly. Well, that's
My dad was from Widnes, and that's what he lived in different cities around the country, and he went, people in Leeds don't understand how beautiful
It's
this is.
so green,
Because of the
it's
parks and the
beautiful.
green areas.
And
And
you don't
going
have
through
to-
what you can walk from the outskirts of Leeds all the way to the middle of Leeds in
Yeah.
places.
It's true.
There's just one last question here, and then I am really mindful of time, and probably that we have to wrap up. So, question over here,
Well, it's
please.
more a comment than a question. I wonder if, in trying to crack the code of the Leeds writer and thinking about voice, I mean, it's what we're talking about perhaps is a critical voice, and that sense of feeling a right to criticise the really uncomfortable aspects of the place. I mean, you think of the two guys you mentioned, Carol Phillips and David Peace. Leeds doesn't look great.
No.
Because some of the things Andy's been reading this evening, that's that sense of feeling not so much a right, but the confidence to offer a critical rendition. In the same way that I can tell my mum she's not going out in them. That in a sense, that negotiates a kind of loving engagement with the place, which comes out of the capacity to show, as in Phillips's work, The Murder of David Olawale, or David Peace's work, the Yorkshire Ripper, etc. That one wonders if it's the critical voice that really captures the region.
I forgot.
Yes.
Very quickly to that, I would say my problem with that critique would be that I don't think those writers, not that they don't see it as a bad thing, but I think they see it as I don't think they write it as criticism. I think they see that as central to the city. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
They're from Leeds.
Yeah,
They're allowed to because they're Leeds writers.
say that again, sorry.
They're allowed to because they are Leeds writers.
Yeah, but I don't think they're. Maybe we've not got time for this.
I'm not sure because you're from Leeds. I think it's more that you've engaged with the city and you're trying to sort of negotiate a dialogue with it, really, and that's what it is. I'm afraid it comes back to the you love it and hate it at the same time.
Well, that might be. That could actually be a sign that they care about a place.
Yeah, well,
It's that you'll say things to your best
exactly,
friends.
exactly.
Well, that's, I think that's
what. You wouldn't bother with somebody you don't care about.
There's that thing of inside and outside.
It's like the Oscars when they turn the music up when you're going on too long.
I think that sound might be a sign. It was
very good sound.
It was very good sound, whatever it was. Someone's mobile phone ringing. I think probably our time
Was it
is
really?
up.
Was it?
So, I mean, it's fascinating, and I think all I can say is I know some of us are going to go on to Whitelocks, which is, that landmark on the great sort of cityscape of Leeds. So, people are very welcome to come and join us and have more of this discussion, which I think is fascinating.
Please do.
I think we could have filled the time twice over, to be honest. So I've got quite a few thank yous to say, just to wrap up. First of all, thank you very much to the Centre for the Culture and the Arts at Leeds Beckett University, who provided the wine. Thank you very much. Huge thank you to the Leeds Library. Andrew's over there lurking in the corner. It is, as we said last time, it's a fantastic venue for this kind of thing, and to have this space to be able to kind of to discuss these issues, and to have the physical space to be able to talk about space and writing in place and all of that is wonderful. And a final thank you to our two writers who I think have made you work hard for your money tonight. So huge thank you to Richard and to Andy for reading their work.
Thank you very much.
Just two more things which are about future events, really. The first is Chris Nixon, who's here, our historical crime fiction writer, Leeds-based, has a launch here for his latest novel, Skin Like Silver, which is here on Thursday the 3rd of December, is that right? So everyone is welcome to come to that. And then the other thing is the next event in our series, which is with Sanjeev Sahota here back at the Leeds Library, also in December. And we will be doing more of these events into next year too. Some here, some elsewhere. We really want to kind of diversify and look at other genres and other forms as well. And a last thank you to all of you for coming and listening and contributing and really contributing to a really good debate, I think, about place and writing and what Leeds is, really. Yeah, great. So last applause to you.